There we go. We're live. Good morning, everyone. So we're trying a new format because Dan and I are even more socially distanced right now.
We're trying to behave.
Yeah, our Minnesota has a shelter-at-home order in effect. There is an exclusion, like since we're creating religious content, we could be in the same space, so we might do that again. But we're trying this format out, which will be useful for doing interviews in the future. But for now, if you're seeing this and you want to comment, or is there any way you could put on headphones, Dan, because I'm hearing the feedback from your audio?
Well, I just turned off my sound.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Is headphones better though?
I think so. Oh, and there's Ellen saying hello. Hi, Ellen. Pardon the kinks. We're getting this started, and we won't do the awkward tech check-in probably in the future after this. This is our first time using this platform. But just to get us started.
Makes this seamless, cool.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
And that sounds, your voice is coming in stronger anyways. No.
Okay, how's that?
Great, perfect.
Is that good?
So
okay.
Let's restart. Good morning, everybody. This is Transmission. This is the collaborative stream that the Center for Prophetic Imagination and the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing puts on together. I'm Mark Van Steenwyk, the director of the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert, the director of MICA, Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. I need to take out one of those earbuds, otherwise it just sounds too weird in my head.
Yeah, I always sound weird in my head. I'm so glad other people can't hear what's going on in here. But our episode today, we're going to talk about what comes after the pandemic. And I'm assuming this is a theme that will come back up in future broadcasts for as long as we're doing this during these times of uncertainty. But today we're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like, what we anticipate is coming, what's changing as a result of this, but then also maybe some of our hopes. So I'm sure there are pessimistic predictions, but we could maybe engage a little bit in wishful thinking, like wouldn't it be nice if kinds of stuff too. But and just to kind of frame it, I just what I'm noticing within myself and within others right now is a lot of us have been knocked indoors, and our sense of work and time has shifted. So many people are commenting like they can't even tell what day it is. And so there's this forced introspection that's happening where people are beginning to ponder things. And things, like we brought up in one of our earlier broadcasts, people are questioning what was necessary, because all of a sudden most of us are out of functional work and realizing some of that work wasn't really necessary for our society, right? We're realizing which things are most essential.
Yeah.
And we're starting to think, well, what could this look like? What things, if these things are necessary and other things aren't as necessary, which of those not as necessary for daily life things really should be a part of a good society? And which things maybe should we do without? What does it look like? What would a good society that's structured for the common good? Because right now we're seeing the United States is not really structured for the common good. Capitalism doesn't generally work to the common good. We don't have surplus. Stores are about making profit rather than having enough to provide for folks. Our hospital system is a profit-based one, so we don't have, we're not a national health service. So a lot of things in a time of pandemic are coming to light that this isn't set up for us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, and it's interesting because you said most of us are out of work, and I mean, that's not really completely true, right? I mean, there's actually these sort of huge divides, right? So you have all these people that have work, mostly that are in the hospitality industry in one way or another. You then have all these people that have been bumped to working from home very quickly.
Yeah. I was kind of lumping them in the out of work.
Yeah, and and then of course you have all these people that truly do essential, helpful work, right? Who in many ways their jobs have now become infinitely more risky and difficult, right? So healthcare people, grocery store people, I mean, I was in the post office the other day and I'm thinking about these poor people behind the counter, and I'm like, the odds of them getting this thing are incredibly high, right? As they're still trying to help people with their mail and all this other stuff. And so, right. So the people that are doing this very essential, important work are in even more danger, right? The system is working even less well for them. Yeah. And then you have all these other folks that are either not working or trying to figure out, what's really important about my work. And so one of the things that we had talked about before getting together was, Mark, maybe for you to share a little bit about this concept of prefigurative movement work and politics as a way of kind of framing this whole conversation.
Yeah, and I'll do that. And then I'm going to respond a little bit to Ellen's question that's popped up here. But yeah, I think from prefigurative politics is a way of talking about a way of approaching politics where a collective or a group of people of varying sizes tries to embody what they would like to see have happen for the larger society or the world. So prefigurative politics could be an intentional community that composts everything and lives almost off the grid, so that's like makes this environment better rather than worse, where people make egalitarian decision-making, where it's like they're just trying to live out their ideals in a way that isn't just for them, but also to show the rest of society what it could be like. And, I think there's a lot of strength in that kind of approach. There's some downsides. It doesn't solve everything. It has to engage with larger movements, I think, for it to be really
right. Yeah.
But right now is a time when people are kind of thinking about like what society should look like.
Right.
And almost always comes back to like, well, how do I do that?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it almost seems to me now that there are like millions and millions of little experiments in prefigurative politics going on, right? Like all these people who are at home, they're at home with their kids, they're relating to their families, they're trying to figure out like which of their neighbors can they interact with and how can they do that. I've seen these pictures of like, I saw one of a whole block, right? They made all these circles. They drew these circles of chalk in the street, and then they all came out at like 6 o'clock in the evening to exercise together. And everybody stood in their little circles, which were 6 feet apart. And obviously this is something that neighborhood has never done. And now they're doing it, and everybody looks really happy, and they're thinking, wow, this is kind of cool to do this. So it almost seems like spontaneously there are all these experiments in this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think there's good reason for that. One, because our governments aren't doing a great job, and we're also in a time of a shared crisis. It makes sense that we would figure out what does togetherness look like and how can we help each other because we need help. And so like our neighborhood, like South Minneapolis, there's like a Google Doc where what do you have? What do you need? Kind of mutual aid stuff is starting to pop up because there's need for it, which isn't a new thing by any means, but mutual aid happens in societies where there's not enough aid otherwise. And so people are starting to think about what does mutual aid look like? People are learning how to figure out how to do stuff themselves from home a little bit more than maybe they would, like even if it just means cooking more of their own meals. There's definitely the shift towards a local-based economy approach and mutual aid.
Yeah. So you said that Ellen had a question. For some reason, I can't find where the questions are live, so you'll have to sort of handle that.
Okay, I'll do that. Ellen says, is work versus job what you mean by functional work? I'm not sure how I or Dan used the word functional work, but I do think the distinction of job versus work I think is important right now. I was having a conversation with a housemate or a former housemate, he lives next door. And one of the things we do for mutual aid is our next door neighbors and us are pretty close. And so at 2 o'clock every day, we go sit socially distanced around a campfire in the backyard. And we each have a beer and like just talk as a way of like, being sociable. But we were talking about how, since he's not able to do his job right now, it doesn't mean that there isn't work. Like work encompasses all sorts of activities. Work is about how you live and contribute.
Yeah.
And jobs can be work. But oftentimes in our society, capitalist society, jobs don't like align with a sense of vocation for the common good. So they become jobs, something that people do for money. Maybe it's not, you wouldn't think of it as a work, like something that you do to change society or contribute to society. We tend to overlap those, but there's a subtle difference there. And so bullshit jobs, which we could, Dan, maybe you can talk about this in a second, jobs that don't actually help anyone, to me are their jobs, but it's hard for me to think of them as work in a positive sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I think about functional work, again, whether it's a job or not, and I think obviously in our history, the best example of this is women working at home, right? So housewives, which, our society for a long, long time, and I think still in many quarters, people don't think of this as real work. Obviously, it is real work. And to me, functional work are things that are actually needed to either keep us alive, make life happen, or or things that enhance our lives, right? So, but on the other hand, right, and what Mark referred to, and we talked about this in an earlier episode, this guy, David Graeber, who's an anthropologist at the London School of Economics, and wrote this very interesting article a few years ago on the phenomenon of bullshit jobs. And it's this very short article. It's about 3 pages long. And he tells a story about this in the book that he then wrote about it. He wrote this article and he then actually went camping, I think, or he went to some cabin in the woods. I think it was in Canada. And so he had no idea what was going on with this article. And he comes out of the woods a few days later, and this thing has gone viral, and he's getting hundreds of thousands of emails in reply to this, with all these people resonating about how their jobs have no meaning. And so he then did a bunch of research based on this and expanded it into a book. And, his estimate based on his research is that about a third of the jobs in so-called advanced capitalist societies are essentially meaningless. They really do not contribute to anyone's good. And one of the things he found about this is that what they do contribute to is people's decreased mental health. And again, I think that's one of the things that we're sort of finding now, where we're sort of forced to figure out just how to retool our lives and how to survive. I mean, a lot of people that I'm talking to are saying, yeah, I'm really spending a lot of time with what is meaningful now, as opposed to things that are superficial or not meaningful.
And I think this raises the question of what we're seeing, things pared down to somewhat essentials. I mean, I think there's things that are conducive to like healthy life that we can't do now. So I think being able to hang out with each other in large groups is essential. But like when it comes to maybe some of the economics and things that we need to for basic survival, we're seeing some things stripped away. But then also like, and that raises the question of like, well, if we're stripping down, what do we build back up with later? And we're seeing the fault lines of capitalism. Maybe we could do something different later. Or in the terms of church, which is another conversation, what will happen with the idea of church after this? Because a lot of people went to church out of habit, and now the habit's broken. And so maybe the first couple of weeks missing church, they're like, oh, my life, I don't know what to do without church. And maybe by the third or fourth week, they're starting to feel like strangely relieved. They don't have to go. And so maybe people will stop going, or maybe we're realizing like the reason you went before was to listen to a sermon, and now you can just listen to your good old pastor live stream, and it's not as important. Or maybe it's showing the flaws of church, like how long it took. I saw some people commenting how right when social isolation began, they needed some stuff, and they told it to like some prayer group from their church over live stream, and all of them said, well, I'll pray for you, and none of them attempted to meet that need. Because churches aren't really generally structured to meet needs. All these things are being exposed, and it raises a question of what should church look like?
Right.
What should our society look like? And what do we expect things because of this to move towards that should vision, or do we think things are going to get worse?
Yeah.
Because that's the other piece of it, is the whole idea of the crisis capitalism, where I feel pretty convinced that after this is done, the billionaire class will have more money, we'll all collectively have less, and then the government will have like thrown us the bone of $1,200, and so we'll think somehow have hope that the government is shifting towards progressivism because of that, when that's not true. They're just throwing us a bone to keep us happy and alive for now.
Yeah.
Where does it go?
So I think one of the things that might be fun, and again, I don't know what's popping up on the feed.
Not a lot right now. So please bombard us with your ideas and questions.
Well, and one of the things that might be fun is to say, so what are you noticing that is really of value in this time? Either that you're doing, or as Mark mentioned, there are some things we're noticing of value that we're not able to do. And we're now very aware of that, of how valuable that is. So, I mean, I think some of the things, one of the things that I'm really noticing that we've been involved with trying to help with a little bit with Micah, and I'm aware of it because, my son Max and his partner are part of this, is, the arts, right? The live arts have essentially been annihilated by this. And all of these things have been canceled. All these people are out of work in a very, very big way and very dramatic. And so that's something that is clear to me. I mean, I always felt it before, but I feel like it's even clearer now that that's of incredible value, right? And our society doesn't do a good job supporting that. And so, how might we retool society to be even more supportive and friendly to the live arts, which really do enrich our lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. And now's a time when people, if there was more of a nurturing space for it, this is, I think a lot of people are probably engaging in creativity in the arts now, and that's something that our society doesn't nourish very much, like you're saying.
Yeah. And, and then I think certainly this other issue of connection and how do we connect? I mean, one of the things that I have noticed and a couple of people have talked about, it's always felt very weird to me walking around town, and I do that a lot, probably at least as much as anybody, more than most people, is that people never look at each other or say hi to each other, right, in our normal course of life. Now, suddenly, with this whole social distancing, as two people approach on the sidewalk, they kind of move away from each other. But people are actually looking at each other and saying hi. And it's really nice. It's great, and I've always felt like it's very odd that we don't do that. And for some reason, probably because we're all cooped up and isolated and we feel kind of funny about having to walk far apart from each other, we're suddenly saying hello to each other. And I think that would be wonderful. It's a very simple thing, but to me, it's a very significant experience that I think would be great if that would continue.
Mm-hmm. I think other things that it's actually like been interesting to note my mental health during this time, because it was hard for me at first, and now I'm kind of enjoying the sense of not having to do stuff. Like, it's the ultimate, like, I don't have to engage in activities I didn't want to. Like, before I felt like there was some pressure. And so now I'm spending more time with my family, which has its ups and downs, but it's generally positive.
Right.
And so I have this freedom to engage in like activities that were better for my soul in some ways. And how good would it be for us to create space for the things we're discovering are very life-giving during this time? And say, look, maybe we can set limits to what we feel like we have to do. If I enjoy sitting around a fire with my friends next door and having a beer, maybe I should do more of that. Right. If I'm enjoying having unhurried time where I can spend a lot of time with my son, or he's enjoying doing lots of art because he doesn't have as much homework, maybe it should be more of that. Like, how do we structure our society to like make more space for life-giving things? Yeah.
Well, and for those of you that remember a time before the computer, right? Yes. I mean, computers were supposed to do this. right? That this was one of the whole things, was that this was going to be this great time-saving device. And the idea was that the work week would actually go down to 20 hours. And so then we would have all this time to do all the kinds of things that we're talking about. Of course, the exact opposite has happened. We're now working more hours than ever, and we've got this whole feeling that we have to be going 24/7. Yeah, and maybe that's one of the things that comes out of this, is that we realize, like, oh, actually having that kind of balanced life of, working the fewer hours. And and again, what's interesting is that both with work and school, there's been research into this that have all been totally ignored, right? And so the research has been that, in a 6-hour school day, kids really are only doing about 2 hours of schoolwork. And in an 8-hour workday, people are really only doing about 2 to 3 hours of very productive work. And maybe that's one of the things that we're finding right now, right? Is that actually when we're at home and working from home? I mean, I had somebody say this to me the other day about an organization that had really resisted having people work from home. Now it's been forced to do that. And she said, oh, and big surprise, we're finding that everybody's doing their work really well and actually doing it quicker and more efficiently. So, maybe that's one thing that we really need to be a lot more vocal about, is that a lot of this forced, time in the office and quote work time that isn't really work time. Maybe we need to specifically say, what would it be like if the workday was only 4 hours and the school day was only 3 hours? And what else would we then use that time for, as you said, for the creative, really life-giving things?
Here's a comment from Catherine. See, I can do that too, I just discovered. Also, childcare and housework is hard and time-consuming labor. That's true. Like, one of the things I've noticed and other people have noticed is they thought, since I'm home and maybe if I don't have to do work right now, like my job isn't happening right now, they're realizing that they don't have as much free time as they thought. Because there's all these sorts of projects they've been putting off, like just even getting their house clean. If they have kids, childcare, like suddenly you can't just rush off to a restaurant for a meal or meet with people over a meal. So you have to prepare 2 or 3 meals for yourself every day. And this shows, like, that's all work.
Right.
It's actual work. And you can spend lots of hours a day just taking care of your physical needs and keeping your space clean. And I think we've taken that for granted a little bit.
Well, we've both taken it for granted and dismissed it as valuable work, right? Yeah. We have refused to sort of put an economic value on it. We've refused to put a moral and just sort of general communal value on it. Childcare workers and restaurant workers are some of the lowest paid workers in our society. Right. And as Catherine's saying, like, now suddenly we're finding out, whoa, this is really hard work, and teachers too. And I've seen a lot of people talking about this, of like, oh my gosh, like, you do amazing things, because now I'm just home with 1 or 2 kids and trying to teach them is really hard. And so suddenly, the work that capitalism has said is not valuable is now suddenly coming to the fore as maybe being the most valuable, which I think is a great, again, prefigurative exercise to think about, okay, so then moving forward into the future, are we going to retain those learnings and apply them on a wider social scale, or at least advocate that they get applied on a wider social scale?
And to me, there's 2 sides to this, and maybe we can shift a little bit into more speculation. But to me, it's revealing 2 things. Like, one, I've joked about it, other people have joked about it, how if this were a zombie apocalypse, would I be somebody who survives it? And so you realize which skills that do I have cultivated skills that are useful in that kind of base level kind of culture where it's based on meeting material needs. And a lot of my training is not. Like, you start having, I do think religion and spirituality is essential to life. But when you're focusing on material reality, you have to make the case that things that aren't immediately beneficial you have to like argue for them being useful for society. And so there's that zombie apocalypse thing. And then the other piece of it is like, which things, if we're going to do things beyond basic needs, like what are the things that are most ennobling and bettering for us? We know that the arts are like, we would all live very dreary lives without the arts. And so we want them there. I'd be okay living without people who are investment brokers. Like I'd be okay without that. Right. And so I'm wondering if we can maybe start thinking, as we got only a little bit of time left, and maybe this is for people watching, you can jump in with your thoughts. Where do you think this all might be headed? If you had to say like what positive and negative changes you think might come about because of this pandemic, in light of some of the things we're talking about, or just your own speculations, where do you think it's going? What's shaking loose one way or the other, for better or for worse right now?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, I mean, to be brutally honest, I think that there's going to be an incredible pull for things to not change from the vast majority of folks. I think that's just kind of the way humans and habitual patterns work. But I do think, and in religious language and the spiritual life, right, there's this image of seeds being planted that eventually grow into something else and something different. And so I do think that all of these experiences are planting a lot of seeds in people's minds and hearts. And I do think, I know that people are talking about all these things because I'm already, after a very few number of days, I'm hearing this a lot from people that I'm talking to. And so I think that these seeds of like, how do we live a life that is more meaningful, deeper, so less superficial, one that really values what is important, all of that, what values work that is of value, and also people talking about connecting to nature, right? Do I learn to forage? Do I learn to spend more time out in nature that's life-giving? I mean, I think all of these things are seeds that are being planted that, we're not going to see a total overhaul of society come September, but I do think that over time we are going to see some growth in all of these areas in different ways.
That's what I hope. I think my pessimistic tendency is to see things getting worse before they get better.
Yeah.
Partly because I think it's partly the way social discourse works. The way conservatism tends to work currently in our society is dismissing complexity for easy answers. I mean, this is why Trump has so much power and was able to become president. And I think in times of crisis, easy answers are nicer, even if they're odious. If you get enough people to go along with them, it'll shift things right. And it tends to be that progressivism adds complexity because it's trying to understand complex things. Mm-hmm. And I think this is part of like why I think progressivism in our society is having so much difficulty, but then also why progressive churches don't do great is there's something about further left radicalism that is not trying to make things overly simplistic, although it can, but it's trying to get at the root of the issue and name the root. And I don't think the left in American society is good enough at naming, then the right is good at giving slogans. Yeah. Right? So but how do we tell a story that's captivating and compelling in the midst of this time?
Yeah, and I do think, though, that one of the things that sort of works in favor of that complexity or that deepness right now is the fact that this is going to take a lot of time.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, one of the things that works in favor of those slogans is when you have to be super fast, and our society is moving in this super fast pace. And so all you have time for is, make America great again. But now, one of the things that I think people are starting to get about this is that they actually have a lot more time to reflect more deeply on these things. And that time of reflection, I think, and again, this is the heart of the spiritual life, right, brings more wisdom. And so, whereas in many ways, I tend to mirror your pessimism about these big changes. I don't really call it pessimism. I'm sort of just more realistic, is the way I would call it. But I do think, again, that the more space we can all take during this time to really reflect deeply on, okay, what am I noticing that's meaningful? That's the basic spiritual direction question. What are we noticing? And the more time we take for that, that allows these seeds to send down these deeper roots, and it allows us to be more aware of what is going to be life-giving for us, which then gives us the energy to make those changes.
Yeah. I think that's right. And this slowing down. And I think it's interesting. My brain kind of went towards this assumption that somehow the ability to think is a privilege for the upper classes. So there's this idea that if you are a working class, you don't have time to think. And so we shouldn't expect much. That's almost the subtext. Don't expect much from the work. Like, we know that for example, people, serfs in feudal times had more free time.
Right.
This is just a dumb idea. And almost every working class movements tend to be where my hope is, rather than
liberation theology.
There's plenty of amazing, brilliant thinking that can come from the bottom of society up. And I think this is a time where we get to see some of that. Okay, we're in this situation, and who's benefiting from it? This is a time when we all know that some people benefiting disproportionately to others during this time is gross. But that's how it's always been. It's always been gross. It's always been gross for a few to benefit at the hands of the many because we're always in some sort of struggle for survival. It's just, this underscores it. And so I'm hoping that people get rightfully upset about how it's going in, and that, like you say, it plants seeds. It bleeds into the rest of our reality post-pandemic. So we say, look, if we have another crisis, we're not going to do it like that again. This is time for us to create a government for us all. This is a time for us to realize that resources should be for the benefit of the many, and we need to figure out how to take care of each other and the earth better. I mean, that's obviously where my hope goes. Again, I'm pessimistic in the short run. I feel like we're more likely to end up with a Gilead in the short term than we are with a utopia. But the seeds and the possibilities for something better are here. And so I think now's the time for discernment and figuring out, what does it look like to act in this time where it's hard to know how to act.
Great. All right. Well, good to be with you all. And thanks for trying this new format with us.
And now that we've got this figured out, I think our plan for the foreseeable future is to do 10 a.m. Central Standard Time, weekday mornings. And if we're not going to have a broadcast, we'll tell you in advance. And I'm hoping we'll get an opportunity to maybe bring some other people into the conversation now that we have our multi-site streaming set up. One last comment, just because Catherine put something up here. There's a couple more. Can we just have a couple of questions, Dan?
Yeah, sure.
Catherine writes, yes, nothing like seeing empty shelves to understand the importance of grocery workers, truckers, farm laborers, retail janitors. That's right.
Exactly.
And then Deborah writes, I'm wondering how this pandemic supports an evolutionary jump in consciousness. The veil, I'm assuming, has been pulled back to reveal things we couldn't see before.
Right. We've been talking a lot about that, and I think that time for reflection is exactly part of that. Because that deep contemplative time is what helps accelerate that evolutionary change in consciousness. And so, I think there is a lot of potential for that right now.
Yeah, I always struggle with this idea of collective consciousness building. I think there's some strengths to that way of looking at it and some not strengths. I tend to look at it in terms of how is this an opportunity to change our collective narrative, to be a narrative guy. And I think, which are very similar ways of looking at things, I think now is an opportunity for us to change the framing narratives of our society more than I've seen in my lifetime. And part of it is because whether you like Bernie Sanders or not, he's been helping change the narrative. And there were movements that helped get him there, like Black Lives Matter, Occupy. Those were changes of narratives within kind of the progressive side of things. And now those things have kind of burst into the mainstream, which creates opportunities for new narratives. But yeah, I think for those who have eyes to see, the veil is being pulled back, and it gives me hope. Another comment here from Kevin. I'm noticing that a stream of crises have been happening over the past several years. What impact will this collective reality have?
Right.
I think it's the same thing. I think crises are apocalyptic moments where we get to see how things work in a way that's laid bare, and in other times it's more hidden.
Well, and I do think, climate change has sort of receded to the background in the midst of this particular crisis. But I do think that Kevin's right. And I think all of these crises are very much connected to climate change. Mm-hmm. And I do think, of course, there's always that open question of kind of how many crises can an ecosystem handle before it totally collapses. And so to me, I mean, that is a realistic issue. And I think that for me personally, that just adds to the urgency of this work. We don't know how much time we're kind of given for all of this transformative activity, and it'd be better to get started sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Amen. I think with that, we're going to close out. And some of these questions that we're starting to end up with, I'm assuming we're going to talk about next week a little bit of, there's someone we're trying to line up an interview with, talk about organizing and activism in light of this pandemic. Like what does it look like? Where is this headed in that regard? And Dan and I have other topics we've been brewing. If you have things you'd like us to talk about, feel free to comment in one of these threads. I'm sure we'll see it and we'll be able to respond that way.
Yeah, or message us individually.
Before we head out, Kevin Olson says hi, Dan.
Hey, Kevin. All right, thanks for watching all.
Thanks for joining us.
Yep, bye.